Well, headlines about John A. Macdonald's support of residential schools have been big news lately. Yesterday, we brought you some tape from Senator Marie Sinclair saying he believes pulling Macdonald's name and tributes, taking them down, might cause more harm than good. He says we should instead be paying our respects to First Nations historical figures and heroes. But how do you do that? Do you think about statues, faces on dollar bills? David Garneau is here to talk about what he thinks might be a starting point. He is a Métis visual arts professor at the University of Regina and has done a lot of extensive research in contemporary Indigenous arts. He's in studio to share what he thinks might work. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what do you think when you hear Senator Marie Sinclair saying, instead of focusing on all the negative with Macdonald, let's focus more on Indigenous heroes and start thinking about celebrating them? What's your take on that?
He couched that in terms of reconciliation, and I used to work in daycare and certainly realized that it's way better to give positive reinforcement for good behavior than to punish bad behavior. That said, a war of monuments doesn't seem to me a very productive thing to do.
And when you say a war of monuments?
Yeah, to erect another statue to counter or to balance off the statue of John A. Macdonald, that sort of thing, seems counterproductive. And we're just setting up another figure, this sort of great man of history idea.
So what's wrong with that, though? Tell me more about why we shouldn't build statues and say let's celebrate Indigenous heroes in the past. What would be wrong with that?
Well, I'll start with John A. Macdonald. So the erection of the John A. Macdonald sculpture in Regina was a provocative act. There's no other statue in the prairies. There's none in BC except for Victoria. There's one or two, or there's two in Ontario. I don't think they do it in Quebec. So it was a provocative act to put the sculpture of John A. Macdonald in the city that where Louis Riel was hung. So from an Indigenous point of view, when I moved here 18 years ago, I saw that. I was shocked. It was quite stunning. But I think it was there to let Indigenous people know who's the boss, and to get proud Métis First Nations people to erect another monument to a proud hero would be a similar act. And so that's fighting fire with fire, in my view. So an Indigenous response would probably to put up a statue of someone quite benign and sweet and loving. That would be fine. But I think that there would be something more interesting would be other public art that wasn't so focused on people, but focused on relations.
Like what?
There's a lot of public art sculpture that are, I would say, of an engaged nature. I'm going to be honest. I'm working on a bridge called the Tuatha Bridge, and I'm really excited what's happening in Edmonton. They've got an Aboriginal art park, no monuments to people, all kinds of things that play with language in this site. The bridge will have 400 paintings that depict there will be some people in there, but mostly depicting relationships to nature and the mixed use of that area. I just think that it's much more interesting than focusing on a person who's dead.
But the art represents people. You don't think that sends the same message?
Well, it represents relationships more. So the relationships of those people to that territory and the land, rather than the usually great man.
So what's the response then to the statue of John A. Macdonald, which stands? That's still there. So does that stay? What do you think the response is to that?
Well, I think what happened in Germany and in Russia is you have places where these things were just destroyed. I mean, that's the history of these kind of monumental projects. But I think that it's an important history lesson. I'm grateful that it's there in one way because it's something that I can respond to. So I've done performances where I dressed as Louis Riel and I had a conversation with that statue, with the one in Kingston and the one in
What kind of
Ottawa.
Conversation?
It was silent. When I started off with conversations, I'd written something that was basically a Shakespearean soliloquy. And then I realized that I was just engaging. I was rising to the bait. And so in the Riel character, I start off trying to be a monument, like John A. Macdonald holding the scroll and so on. And then I turn my back on that and smudge. This is what I mean by going in relation rather than trying to be another great man to counter this great man.
It's hard, though, when you look at the fact that, like you're saying, don't build more statues, don't get into a battle. But the fact is that these plaques and statues that exist across Canada now, they're all there. And for the most part, they all celebrate the white men of history, right? And I know Cindy Blackstock is doing work. I don't know if you've heard about it with the cemetery in Ottawa, the National Cemetery in Ottawa, not taking down the plaques, but for instance, with Davin, getting the plaque revised to add that, yes, he did contribute this and this and this, which were positive, but adding that he was also the architect of residential schools. So that's her approach. But what do you do with the fact that right now it's not any kind of even playing field? The country is dominated with plaques and statues that are tributes to these white men of history.
Yeah, I really agree with the plaques. The language is another thing. So you go to Toronto and now they use Indigenous languages for some of the street signs. That you see that in BC. In Auckland, New Zealand, all the signs are in Maori as well as English. Kelowna at the university, they all have the local Indigenous languages. To me, that's exciting. This city has very few markers to Indigenous people in terms of streets. I think there's maybe 6 or 7. I spent a lot of time in Calgary. You got Shaganappy Trail, Crowfoot Trail, Deerfoot Trail. There's all these reminders of Indigenous presence, whereas here there's an absence.
So how do you see renaming? The idea has been brought forward about renaming Dewdney in Regina.
I would be all for that. See, I'm talking about the difference between the language and things that move easily versus a sculpture, a work of art that stands for a human being. That, to me, is a little bit different. And I'm also all in favor of these changed plaques because people will say we can't change history. You can't change the past, but the history is these documents, these things we use to reflect on the past. So especially in text and language, we can update and change those all the time.
Where are you at with this bridge? What's happening right now?
It's 2 more years to go. I had 6 or 7 students working with me this summer and a crew in Edmonton. It's actually pretty exciting, but it's daunting dealing with all these problems. Who do you represent? How do you represent? Who are you leaving out? This is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's so tricky, right? And then you wonder what we're doing today that's going to be looked back and debated in ways we can't imagine 20, 50
That's
years
right.
from now.
I have a lot of empathy for anybody who's made art in the past. But that's why I think artists are working on strategies other than the easy one of just making a piece that looks like a person.
Right. Yeah, thanks. It's a complicated discussion, and thanks for weighing in. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.